King Charles has ordered for Queen Camilla and her children to be kicked out of Birmingham Palace and never to return after his divorce with Camilla. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. From the outside, everything looked settled. In the months leading up to the alleged rupture, King Charles and Queen Camilla appeared exactly as the palace wanted them to appear, composed, synchronized, unshaken. Their public appearances were measured and carefully spaced, their body language neutral enough to avoid scrutiny, their smiles practiced but not excessive. To the casual observer, this was the image of a royal partnership that had endured its worst trials and emerged intact. But stability in royal life is often an illusion built on timing and restraint. What the public sees is never the whole story. It is the final draft, edited until the seams disappear. Inside palace walls, calm does not mean peace. It often means control. For years, aides had described King Charles as deeply sensitive to atmosphere. He noticed changes in tone, subtle shifts in loyalty, the quiet ways people behaved differently when they believed power was moving. He was not impulsive, but he was deliberate. When he decided something mattered, it consumed him. And when he decided something no longer served him, he did not cling to it out of sentiment. Queen Camilla, by contrast, had learned survival through endurance. Decades of waiting, public hostility, and private compromise had shaped her into someone acutely aware of her place. She knew when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. She understood that visibility could be both a shield and a weapon. And she had spent years mastering the art of appearing unbothered, even when the ground beneath her felt unstable. In this period, their dynamic was described by insiders as functional, not affectionate. There was no public drama, but neither was there warmth behind closed doors. Conversations were polite, sometimes clipped. Decisions increasingly flowed through intermediaries. Where once there had been shared routines, there were now parallel lives that rarely intersected unless necessary. This was not unusual by royal standards. Many royal marriages evolve into something closer to partnership than romance. But those closest to the situation sensed something different. A withdrawal. A recalibration. Small signs appeared first. Camilla's circle quietly shrank. Invitations once assumed were suddenly tentative. Aides who had worked closely with her for years found themselves reassigned without explanation. These changes were never announced. They were simply implemented, wrapped in administrative language that masked their significance. At the same time, King Charles began relying more heavily on a tight group of advisors whose loyalty was unquestioned and whose worldview leaned toward preservation of authority above all else. Their priority was not personal happiness, but institutional stability. And in their calculations, optics mattered more than emotions. Birmingham Palace, during this time, remained outwardly unchanged. Staff rotations continued. Security remained consistent. There were no visible signs that it had become a focal point of tension. And that was precisely what made later developments so jarring. Because when a storm is coming, the quiet beforehand is rarely natural. It is manufactured. Publicly, Charles and Camilla attended engagements without incident. They stood side by side at formal events. They exchanged polite remarks with diplomats. Cameras captured moments that suggested cooperation, if not closeness. Headlines reflected this narrative. Commentators praised their professionalism. Some even noted that the monarchy appeared steadier than it had in years. Yet behind the scenes, communication had become procedural. According to individuals familiar with palace operations, direct conversations between Charles and Camilla were increasingly rare. Messages were relayed through staff. Decisions affecting shared spaces were discussed in meetings where one or the other was conspicuously absent. This was not accidental. It was strategic. When personal relationships deteriorate within institutions, the first casualty is spontaneity. Everything becomes scheduled, documented, controlled. And control, in royal life, is never neutral. Camilla's children noticed the shift before anyone else. Not because they were told anything outright, but because access changed. Visits felt shorter. Conversations felt guarded. Doors that had once been open were now closed under the pretense of privacy or protocol. No one explained why. For a family accustomed to existing at the edges of royal life, this ambiguity was unsettling. They had always understood that their connection to the palace was conditional. But conditions had never felt so fragile. Meanwhile, Charles was increasingly preoccupied with legacy. Advisors say he spoke often about how history would remember him. about the need for clarity, about the dangers of ambiguity in leadership. These were not abstract concerns. They were personal. He had waited a lifetime for the crown. And once he had it, he was acutely aware that time was no longer generous. Every decision now felt permanent. Every compromise felt like a potential weakness future historians might dissect. In that mindset, unresolved personal matters were not just emotional burdens. They were risks. The palace machinery responded accordingly. Legal consultations quietly increased. Not dramatic meetings, but routine briefings framed as contingency planning. Property arrangements were reviewed. Residence usage was reassessed under the guise of efficiency. Language shifted from shared to allocated. These were not the actions of a household confident in its permanence. Yet nothing leaked. Not directly. The palace remained sealed, its silence intact. Royal watchers later remarked that this period was deceptively dull. No scandals. No explosive headlines. No confrontations. And in retrospect, that absence of drama was itself the warning sign. Because when the monarchy prepares for rupture, it does so quietly. It drains the emotion from the process long before the public becomes aware. By the time the story breaks, the decisions have already been made. Camilla, for her part, appeared increasingly isolated. Public appearances became more limited. When she did appear, her demeanor was composed, but observers noted a guardedness that hadn't been there before. Smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. A careful distance from Charles that cameras could not fully conceal. Was this marital strain, or something more structural? Those close to her described a woman trying to maintain dignity in the absence of certainty. She did not lash out. She did not demand reassurance. She waited, as she had always waited. But waiting is only sustainable when there is a sense of direction. And here, there was none. The palace, meanwhile, continued projecting normalcy. Schedules were released. Engagements announced. The monarchy, it seemed, was moving forward. And yet, in private, contingency plans multiplied. Security briefings included scenarios that made no sense unless separation was being considered. Staffing models were adjusted in ways that suggested imminent change. Even the language used in internal documents shifted subtly, replacing inclusive terms with singular authority. It was as though the institution itself was bracing. Those who noticed these changes faced a dilemma. Speaking out would mean breaking unspoken rules. Staying silent meant becoming complicit in something they did not fully understand. Most chose silence. That is how royal systems endure. By the time the first serious rumors surfaced, the calm had already served its purpose. The groundwork was laid, the emotional distance established, the practical mechanisms prepared. Whatever was coming would not be spontaneous. And when it came, it would not ask for permission. This chapter of the story matters because it reveals a truth often overlooked. The most dramatic royal moments are never sudden. They are the final act of a process that unfolds slowly, deliberately, and almost invisibly. The calm before the storm is not peace. It is preparation. And in the next chapter, that preparation begins to reveal its deeper roots, stretching back through years of compromise, resentment, and choices that were never truly resolved. Long before crowns, titles, or public acceptance, the relationship between Charles and Camilla existed under pressure. It was never a love story that unfolded freely. From its earliest days, it was shaped by restraint, interruption, and expectation. That history matters, because relationships forged in resistance often carry unresolved fractures long after the resistance ends. When Charles first fell for Camilla, he was not free to choose her. Duty intervened, as it so often does in royal narratives. The institution required a different match, one that fit the image of continuity and innocence the monarchy needed at the time. Camilla was deemed unsuitable, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented: independence, experience, and a refusal to be molded. Their separation did not erase the connection. It froze it. Years passed. Marriages were formed, children were born, lives were built along parallel tracks that intersected in secret and in silence. When Charles eventually married Diana, the world believed it was witnessing a fairy tale. Inside that fairy tale, however, was a tension that would define a generation of royal discourse. Camilla remained present, not publicly, but emotionally. She was not just a former love, she was a constant reference point, an unspoken comparison that haunted a marriage already struggling under the weight of public expectation. When Diana's story ended in tragedy, the monarchy entered one of its most painful periods of reckoning. Public sympathy hardened into scrutiny. Trust fractured. And at the center of that fracture stood Charles and Camilla, symbols of a relationship the public had been taught to resent. What followed was not reconciliation, but endurance. For years, Camilla absorbed hostility that bordered on cruelty. She was blamed not just for a failed marriage, but for the shattering of an illusion the public had desperately wanted to believe in. Every appearance was met with disdain. Every mention reignited old wounds. Yet she stayed. That endurance is often framed as loyalty. But endurance can also be survival. When Charles eventually ascended the throne and Camilla became queen consort, it was portrayed as the culmination of a long, painful journey toward acceptance. In truth, it was the beginning of a new kind of pressure. Because legitimacy, once granted, must be constantly maintained. Camilla's role as queen consort came with unspoken conditions. Be visible, but not dominant. Be supportive, but never directive. Be present, but never central. Her position depended not only on Charles's affection, but on the monarchy's tolerance. And tolerance is not permanence. Inside the marriage, dynamics shifted as power consolidated. Charles was no longer a waiting heir navigating frustration and compromise. He was king. His authority was no longer theoretical. It was absolute within the household. That shift matters. Relationships change when one partner's power expands beyond the private sphere. Decisions that were once negotiated become declarations. Disagreements that were once personal become political. According to those familiar with the couple's private interactions, Camilla struggled with this transition more than expected. Not because she wanted control, but because she was suddenly aware of how little of it she truly had. Her influence, often overstated by critics, was in reality limited and conditional. She could advise, but not decide. Suggest, but not insist. And when her views conflicted with institutional priorities, they were quietly set aside. Charles, meanwhile, became increasingly focused on consolidation. Advisors describe a man determined to shape his reign with clarity and discipline. Emotional ambiguity, once tolerated, became a liability. He wanted order, predictability, a sense that his household reflected the authority he embodied publicly. Marriage, under those conditions, becomes transactional. Affection gives way to alignment. And alignment is fragile when built on years of unresolved history. Camilla's children represented another layer of complexity. Though never part of the royal structure, their proximity challenged the clean lines the monarchy prefers. They were reminders of a life that existed beyond the institution, a life Charles did not fully control. That distinction mattered more as his reign progressed. Insiders suggest that disagreements began surfacing around boundaries. Where Camilla's family fit, how visible they should be, what access they were entitled to. These were not emotional arguments, they were strategic ones. And strategy rarely favors sentiment. What made these tensions particularly volatile was the lack of a shared narrative. Charles and Camilla had survived public condemnation together, but they had never fully reconciled their private expectations. They endured, but they did not always understand each other. Camilla believed endurance had earned her security. Charles believed endurance had already served its purpose. That difference is subtle, but it is everything. Over time, moments of friction accumulated. They were rarely explosive. Instead, they appeared as dismissals. Delays. Decisions made without consultation, each one small enough to dismiss, but together forming a pattern. A marriage can survive many things, but it struggles to survive invisibility. Camilla's role, once framed as supportive, began to feel ornamental. Her presence mattered when it reinforced stability, but her absence was increasingly tolerated. That imbalance breeds resentment, even in the most composed individuals. Charles, on the other hand, appeared increasingly distant. Not cruel, but focused. Detached in a way that signaled finality rather than frustration. He was no longer fighting the past. He was managing the present. And management leaves little room for compromise. The marriage, built on years of defiance and sacrifice, had never truly been rebuilt on mutual clarity. It had simply been carried forward by momentum. And momentum fades when pressure replaces purpose. This is where the story shifts from romance to reckoning. Because when a relationship exists within an institution as rigid as the monarchy, its collapse is never just personal. It becomes procedural, legal, strategic. The question was no longer whether Charles and Camilla loved each other. It was whether their marriage still served the crown. And once that question entered the room, the outcome became far less uncertain. Birmingham Palace was more than just another royal residence. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like a stately home tucked within the sprawling network of royal estates, another point on a map dotted with historic buildings, gardens, and ceremonial halls. To those who understood its history and function, however, it carried layers of meaning few ever articulated. It was not merely stone and timber, it was a symbol. A locus of authority, of accessibility, and of power subtly wielded. For Queen Camilla, Birmingham Palace had come to represent something intimate. Unlike Windsor or Buckingham, it was less public and more personal, a place where she could host family, oversee projects close to her heart, and, in private moments, be more than the queen consort the world expected her to be. Its rooms had seen laughter, careful conversations with her children, and the quiet rhythm of life that few outside the inner circle could imagine. For her, it was a haven, a foothold in a world that often seemed designed to remove agency from those who lived inside its gilded cages. But with symbolism comes vulnerability. Royal residences are always political spaces. They do not simply house their inhabitants, they frame their occupants. Every room, every corridor, every security checkpoint carries meaning. The monarchy is keenly aware of the stories walls tell, the impressions they give, and the power they project. Removing someone from a palace is more than eviction, it is a declaration. A signal to allies, to staff, and to the public that the person once welcome is no longer sanctioned. And Birmingham Palace, in this unfolding story, was about to become the stage for just such a declaration. Inside, preparations for normal events continued. Staff maintained routines, gardeners pruned hedges with the precision of decades of tradition, and security ensured the grounds were meticulously monitored. Outwardly, nothing seemed unusual. Yet subtle shifts were already occurring. Rooms previously designated for family use were reassigned. Access codes were changed. Meetings once scheduled collaboratively were now filtered through advisors. Each minor adjustment was a small thread in a much larger tapestry of control. Observers would later note that these changes were not abrupt. They were deliberate, almost imperceptible. That is how power often asserts itself. Slowly, quietly, and without fanfare. The moment of revelation, when it comes, carries a weight that makes every subtle signal appear prophetic in hindsight. To the public, Birmingham Palace had long been a symbol of accessibility, a residence associated with approachability and familial warmth within the otherwise rigid royal sphere. Camilla's frequent engagements, small gatherings, and occasional philanthropic events had painted it as a softer, human-centered counterpoint to the grandeur of Buckingham or the historical weight of Windsor. It had become a touchstone for those who wished to see the monarchy as more than an institution, more than protocol, but as a place where humanity could exist behind the gold gates. Yet in a paradox characteristic of royal life, what makes a palace comforting also makes it dangerous. Its symbolic value meant that removing someone from it would resonate far beyond the physical space. It would send a message not only to Camilla and her children but to the entire royal network and, ultimately, to the public. Authority has spoken, and boundaries are no longer negotiable. In the quiet weeks leading up to the alleged order, insiders began to notice small anomalies. Security shifts were reported as routine but appeared unusual to those who had worked the palace for years. Certain staff members were reassigned, subtly but irrevocably, to distant posts or roles that limited access. Private gardens were suddenly cordoned. Key access points were monitored more strictly. These actions, individually mundane, collectively suggested a forthcoming transition, one that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with personal authority. It was in these details that the tension simmered. To understand the magnitude of what was allegedly unfolding, one must grasp the symbolic layers of Birmingham Palace. Unlike Buckingham, whose every room is public theater, or Windsor, whose legacy carries centuries of spectacle, Birmingham existed as a semi-private arena. A royal could step into it and feel control over the space. It offered autonomy without complete exposure, a rare privilege in the monarchy. To be denied entry would therefore be deeply personal. It would not simply displace someone physically, it would strip them of a sanctuary and assert that influence could be revoked without negotiation. Camilla, aware of the palace's significance, reportedly viewed it as both a responsibility and a refuge. Her children, too, understood its importance. Its gardens, its private wings, the spaces that allowed them to experience family life without the constant gaze of cameras or protocol officers. In other words, Birmingham Palace was where private lives intersected safely with public service. And that is precisely why its alleged closure carried such emotional weight. The decision to remove someone from a palace is never made lightly. Historically, it has been reserved for moments of extreme tension, betrayal, or political necessity. In previous centuries, it could signal exile or disgrace. In modern times, it is symbolic but no less powerful. Within royal psychology, the act communicates dominance, reasserts boundaries, and reshapes hierarchies. The message is clear: the crown defines belonging, and when the crown withdraws it, even the most permanent seeming connections can vanish. According to whispers from palace insiders, these dynamics were at play. Staff reportedly sensed a subtle but unmistakable change in atmosphere. The usual warmth of greetings diminished. The tone of meetings became clipped. Orders were delivered without discussion, emphasizing authority over collaboration. Those closest to Camilla observed her growing quietness, the small signs of stress that a composed individual could not completely conceal. What makes this moment especially compelling is how carefully it was orchestrated. Unlike a scandal revealed in tabloids or a public confrontation, the alleged plan unfolded through controlled adjustments, security, scheduling, personnel, and symbolic messaging. The palace was not being stormed, it was being reconfigured. Every action, small and deliberate, increased the impact of the eventual order. To the untrained eye, Birmingham Palace remained calm. To those attuned to its rhythms, every detail screamed otherwise. It was the calm before a storm, but unlike weather, this storm carried consequences measured not in rain or wind but in exclusion, emotional